My name is Kevin Dedicatoria, and I will be discussing the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. Both the United States and European Union economies continued to slump after the Great Recession of 2008-2009, when the planning of TTIP began in 2011. The crises of the euro and economies of individual EU countries remained prevalent alongside the slow US economy. Existing laws and regulations present hurdles for businesses to compete. Tariffs to import EU goods into the US remain a significant burden for EU-made products to enter the American markets, like designer wallets and clothing from Italy and renewable energy technologies from Denmark and Germany. Some US agricultural practices are banned in the EU, such as feeding growth hormones to cows and pigs and genetically modifying corn, which make agricultural exports to the EU all but impossible. The photograph to the right of this slide presents the demographics and contributions between the 28-member European Union and the US in 2013. The EU has a trade surplus over the United States, or we import more EU goods and services in value than what we export to them. However, our per capita income is 10,000 euros higher than the EU. They invest a combined 1.6 trillion euros or $1.75 trillion US in the United States, according to the European Commission. Examples include BMW and Airbus and T-Mobile of Deutsche Telekom. The objectives of TTIP are multifold. Cutting existing tariffs up to 50% or ending some altogether would expand the available goods and services from the US and EU countries in each other's markets, like technology for wind turbines and medical equipment. Existing regulations for consumer goods in both markets would be consistent under TTIP, but that would be challenging and disputed, as I'll talk about later on. Again, the market and resource availabilities would be broadened for both across the Atlantic Ocean, notably American oil and liquefied natural gas and renewable energy equipment for solar and wind from EU nations. Job creation is a goal set by US President Barack Obama, but remains very disputed across the Atlantic Ocean in the EU. The gross domestic products of the US, EU, and individual EU countries would rise up to 110 billion euros or $134 billion for the European Union, 95 billion euros for the US or $107 billion, and 14 billion euros or $14.9 billion or 10 billion pounds sterling for the United Kingdom alone, according to data by the Center for Economic Policy Research. TTIP is anything but perfect. Changing regulations present sharp opposition and concern among EU citizens. The United States, as I mentioned before, tests makeup on animals before being sold to the public, use growth hormones in food for cows and pigs that will later be slaughtered for meat, and use genetically modified organisms and pesticides on crops. These practices, among others, in the US are banned in the European Union. The ethical treatment of animals before being consumed by the human population is more valued in the European Union versus the United States. Although the influx of oil and natural gas from America to the EU would cut dependency on Russia for power, it would hamper the environmental progress and goals for the EU. They have set higher standards for carbon dioxide emissions, but the additional imports and consumption of American oil and liquefied natural gas would increase those CO2 levels. The investor-state dispute settlement remains key to TTIP. The ISDS allows companies to sue national governments for their regulations that hamper the ability to make investments or reap gains from them. However, the justices involved have the power to overturn court rulings and would usually represent multinational corporations when not making decisions. Those who listen and rule on cases remain unknown to the public, plus any outcomes made by the ISDS. National governments can pass laws and regulations without knowing they violated ISDS rulings. The ISDS decisions are final, without opportunities to challenge them or appeal. The worry about job losses among certain EU governments is a concern. The labor and manufacturing costs are cheaper in the US than the European Union and are subjected to more lax regulations that compromises products' quality and safety. The rise of US resources and products raised concern about privatization of EU and member states' government services like healthcare, which I'll explain on my next slide. The dominance of certain American industries worldwide would expand under TTIP at the disadvantage of EU countries and companies. Calls for changing TTIP are ongoing. Carve-outs or exemptions for public services and private industries have been crafted and are in the works. Examples include the UK's national health system or that country's public health care, which will not allow any privatization to American companies, and closing off the French multimedia sector from competition by the vastly resourced American entertainment companies. Changing the landscape in disputes between companies and governments is in the works, but not set in TTIP by private citizens and organizations. Judges would be appointed by governments with criteria like degree of impartiality to avoid conflicts of interest with companies, governments, or both, and deliver decisions that can be contested. Records of judges' rulings and operations of this alternate court would be more accessible to the general public instead of kept secret as the ISDS currently functions. The United States government, their businesses, or both must adopt the regulations and standards to sell final products into the EU. Bans on feeding livestock, growth hormones, animal testing on consumer goods, and using GMOs for food and drinks can be practiced by state or federal law, but the chances of passing those mandates are unlikely to happen for now because of opposition within governments and private businesses like corporate factory farms that donate to US politicians. TTIP is more complex than generally perceived, as are trade agreements made between different countries. In contrast to other trade pacts made with the US, the fear of poor quality and safe products are exported from the US, not the other countries. TTIP is no exemption to protectionism in exempting industries and government services from trade agreements, especially for EU countries. I've left my sources in case you want to learn more about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and the support and opposition within the EU, both from elected officials and private citizens and organizations. I want to thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I'm welcome to hearing any of your feedback.